and players smiling.
But Michael Jordan is not only the best basketball player, but he's the most exciting basketball player to ever play.
Tatum fires away, pumps it in, 51 for Jason Tatum.
The Big Three NBA podcast is powered by the Game Time app. Welcome to another edition of the Big Three NBA podcast. I'm Sherrod Blakely, and I am joined today, first-time guest, longtime friend, Miss Noa Dalzell. Noa, what's going on?
Not much, just day 9 here in Las Vegas. So ready to talk some Summer League.
Yes, you are the last one standing out there. The rest of the media contingent, we have bolted Vegas. That it was just a little too hot for the rest of us, but you're taking it all in. Good for you. Good for you. There's a ton to talk about, but I want us to just kind of really focus as we talk about Summer League, really on the guys that I think most Boston Celtics fans, and I have to say Boston Celtics because we also have the Maine Celtics, which will be kind of our jumping off point. But for the guys that may figure in some way, shape, or form into what the Boston Celtics do this year as far as depth and things like that, I wanted us to just kind of really start going through just some of the guys that may play their way into a potential rotation spot. I think the first one off the bat is Queta, who, and again, I thought he was the one clear potential rotation guy for the big boys, the big Celtics this year. I was just curious, what were your thoughts and impressions of Queta in the couple of games we saw him play?
Yeah, I think we saw him for 2 games. He looked better in the second than in the first. But in both cases, you just see that he has the tools, I think, to be a successful NBA player. And I don't know exactly to what extent or to what capacity or whether that's this upcoming year in Boston or not. But he has a good feel. He's big, he's strong, he moves well. I think the finishing around the rim is something that he's improved with. And the main thing that we have saw in Boston that he had trouble with is actually just like the schemes. And that's just experience. There's no reason to think that he can't figure those things out as he gets kind of more seasoned in the league. And he mentioned picking Al Horford's brain and talking to him throughout the year and kind of learning more. And we know that the Summer League team, when he was playing, was purposefully trying to mix up defensive schemes to give him that practice. So I think he has everything he needs to be an off-the-bench big that can provide some minutes and alleviate some of the load on Al and Porzingis when he's back. And what we saw here at Summer League was more of what I saw every time he was in Maine last year, is that he can easily get you 20 and 12 in this setting. And he can look like one of the best players on the court on any given night. Yeah,
and that's the one thing I want our viewers and listeners to recognize is that Noa has probably watched more of the Maine Celtics than any human who's not on the Maine Celtics payroll. So when she talks about Queta, she's not just talking about the glimpses that we saw in Boston, but she's actually spent some time watching him grow and develop, with the Maine Celtics, who had a really, really good year. I think they got all the way to the championship and came up short. And Queta certainly had a prominent role in that. And another guy who, the few games I caught of the Maine Celtics, Jaden Davison. People forget that this guy was a 5-star recruit coming out of high school, did a 1-year stint at Alabama, turned pro, was a late second-round pick. And there was definitely a guy that the Celtics from day one felt that there was certainly more potential growth than there was actually proven body of work when they selected him in the late second round a couple of years ago. What were your impressions of what he did? And specifically, how much did he help, if at all, his case? Because he was a guy that coming into the Summer League, we really didn't know if he was going to be a Celtic coming into Summer League. So just what do you think he did or maybe missed the mark on as far as, positioning himself to be with the Celtics, for a little bit of time?
Yeah, and I don't know if he'll keep that two-way for the rest of the season, because he's the first player in NBA history now to have 3 consecutive two-ways with the team. And he's in a very unique situation because he's just been full-time in Maine. Like, that's where he's been for, pretty much the entirety of the last 2 seasons. And I've heard from just talking to people here in Vegas that he really was trying to get a fully guaranteed contract and obviously wasn't able to get one in time. But I thought that his Summer League stint was relatively impressive. Like, he looked certainly a lot better than he did last Summer League when he was kind of looking like he was making kind of slow decisions with the ball and racked up a lot of turnovers. He was efficient. The team looked a lot better when he was on the floor than when he wasn't. And that's kind of the story with JD Davison. The more you watch him play, the more you realize that his biggest impact is the way that he's able to kind of, get things organized. And I think a lot of what Joe has talked about with Peyton Pritchard and his game management is something that JD has had a huge point of emphasis on, is kind of learning how to manage the game, and especially playing with so many moving pieces and guys that have known each other for 5 days and people in and out of Maine. So he really assumed that role. I think the same questions remain about him regarding like whether he actually has enough to be a backup point guard in the NBA. And looking at the Celtics team, I don't really see where he has a pathway forward. I think defensively, he's okay. He's not a huge liability, but it's not a point of strength for him the way that it is for some of the other guards, like Jaden, that are also battling for those guard minutes. So I think what we saw from him in Maine is that he continues to improve. He continues to do everything that they're asking of him. His shot looked a lot better. That's always been a question mark with him. If he can consistently hit threes, I think that answers a lot of the questions about him. But I don't know if there's anything he could have shown us in a 5-game span other than like totally, going off and scoring 30 every night and leading this team to a championship or something crazy like that would make me think like this is going to be an NBA player and it's going to, he's going to be contributing to Boston in the near future.
Yeah, the point that you made about his pathway, to me, that more than anything else is the biggest hindrance, because, if there's no clear, lane of that he can take that will get him on the floor with the Boston Celtics, not the Maine Celtics, then I'm not sure if we're ever going to really see him come close to reaching that 5-star recruit potential that he had coming out of high school. As you mentioned, Peyton Pritchard, that's a guy who I thought really stepped his game up this year and was like one of the low-key, kind of impact guys off the bench that they had this year. Then you look at Drew Holiday, best on-ball defender in the NBA, 2-time NBA champion with 2 different teams. And then you got Derek White, the newly minted Olympian Derek White. And so you start looking at the bodies in front of him, and it's like, what can he possibly do to knock those guys off? I mean, it seems his best path is to get on the floor via injury. And again, you start looking at some of the other guys that were, kind of they stood out a little bit in Summer League. You think about a guy like Drew Peterson, who in some respects is in a similar boat. When you look at what Sam Hauser has done and you look at what Sam is showing he's willing to do and get better at. Just your impressions of Drew, and just what did you, because he's another guy that really didn't play a bunch of games. It was almost like, let's just get him out there, crack a sweat, knock a few shots down, and just put him on ice. But for the time we did see Drew out there, what were just some of your thoughts on how he performed?
Yeah, Drew's another guy I watched a whole lot of this past year. And, the Celtics acquired him in December from Sioux Falls. He was with Miami for training camp. And then right away, I asked him who he kind of modeled his game after, thinking that he was like a Sam Hauser type player. And he said Derek White, which was funny to me because he said that he wants to be like an all-around player, a defender, rebounder, passer. And I think the thing about Drew is that he's not exceptional at anything. He's a good shooter, but he's not a Sam Hauser shooter. Right. He's a pretty good passer, but he's not like a Baylor Scheierman passer where right away you're kind of in awe of his passing abilities. So he has to be really solid across the board to kind of earn a roster spot. And I think he's solid sometimes, but then other times you watch him and he looks a little bit too skinny and a little bit of a defensive liability. And other times, his decision-making is a little slow. Something I noticed from watching him, especially in the main playoff run where he had some rough outings there, is that he seems to move a little bit slower than everybody else at points. Like just as far as his decision-making goes, like he'll hold the ball and kind of, it almost looks like his processing is a little bit slower than some of the other guys on the floor. And some of that's experience, it was his first year playing at this level after a good college career. But the thing with him is that he had, I think the last game that he played before he was done for Summer League, he hit 4 of 8 threes. And in those games, he looks really good because now he's kind of this solid all-around guy who can hit threes. And then he'll have a few games where he's 1 for 7 from 3. And then all of a sudden you're like, what is he bringing to the table that is worth, really believing in this guy? So I've had moments where I've been really high on him because when he's hitting his shots and seems to be kind of out of his own head, you can see how he has flashes of just being a really solid all-around player with no glaring weaknesses. And then I've had moments where I'm like, I don't know that he's great enough at anything to warrant a roster spot really anytime in the near future, and certainly here in Boston. So I think the jury's still out on him. I think they like him, and that's why they brought him back. And he seems to have a great attitude and be a good kind of team player and a hard worker. But I haven't seen enough to answer those questions around like what exactly his role can be that it kind of makes fighting for him, worth it.
Yeah, he's been a really difficult one for me to get a pulse for because, to your point, it's not like there's a clear and undeniable, boy, he really sucks at that. He doesn't really have that in him, but I don't watch him play and think like, man, he's really awesome at this. And it's really hard to figure out what to make of him because even though Derek White is not the Celtics' best shooter, he's not. I I don't think he's their best defender. I think he's very good, but I don't think he's their best defender. And I don't think he's their best passer. But when you take those three particular skills and you kind of put him in this big jambalaya pot of talent, he's right up there with the best on his team. And the knack that he has for making shots in clutch moments also adds to his impact as a player. And I don't know if Drew has something similar or some semblance of that kind of difference making element or dynamic in his game. And it's too bad because he's in a situation where you better figure out what you can do really well quickly because the guys ahead of you, they're not going anywhere. Of the guys that we've talked about, Queta is the only one where you can see a legitimately clear path to get on the floor this year. Although another guy who's from that Maine Celtics crew who might have done some things in Summer League to maybe turn some heads, get people thinking a little bit differently. Jaden Springer. He was way better. I mean, he didn't play a bunch of games, but again, in the games that he played, he showed some things that I don't know if the Celtics necessarily thought he had in his bag, or at least even in the Summer League setting.
Yeah, so the thing with Jaden wasn't in Maine this year. He played one game with them, and it was a game in Atlanta where the team was also in Atlanta, so it was really convenient. You could just kind of go over there on the day off, and he was dominating that game. And I remember sitting there and being like, okay, so this is the kind of player that when you think of guys that are not good enough to be NBA players, but are too good for the G League, he's an example of that. And he won finals MVP of the G League, not this most recent season, but the year prior. So I think a lot of us watching Jaden, the same for me, even though I knew all this, I'm sitting there being like, wow, I didn't know he had that. But then you go back and look at his track record and he's proven that at this level, he's an elite player. And, I said something that people were for some reason upset about, but I said that we know that he could score at this level. And the reality is that we do know that he can score at this level. The question is how that translates to Maine, to the Celtics. I really believe in Jaden Springer. And maybe, sometimes I get high on these guys that are really good defenders because I think that you can defend really well. Like you can figure it out in other ways if you're a hard worker. But maybe that's short-sighted. But I thought what we saw of him is that the playmaking was better than I had seen previously. The scoring at that level, he has a good track record of, but the way that he was setting up his teammates was really, really exceptional, taking care of the ball. And then obviously the defense, he was tasked with guarding Jaquez, who was really an NBA player at this point, probably shouldn't even been in Summer League. Right. And he did a really good job. And so he's a guy I would love to see if there's a way to get him on the court next year. It's in some capacity, and it'll probably involve injuries if he does see a real pathway. I don't know that just looking at the numbers that he's going to carve out real minutes otherwise. But then also, a lot of guys are playing Olympic basketball right now. A finals run. Brad talked about this a little bit towards the end of the year there in his media availabilities is that it's going to be, they're going to have to be creative here with rest and load management and kind of the fact that these guys are not going to have a break at all the entire year. So in that sense, maybe Jaden Springer does take a crack at things and actually get some real minutes out there. And I think people forget before he was traded to Boston, he had just entered the Philadelphia rotation and was doing a really good job guarding guys like Steph Curry and Luka Doncic, kind of showing that he belongs.
Yeah, and defense is what's going to get you in the court. I mean, coaches say it sounds like coach speak, but you just look at the guys that kind of come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden they're in the rotation. More times than not, it's because of what they do defensively. I mean, here in Boston, Ray Allen is a legend, and yet as his defense began to kind of peter off, they went with this young kid named Avery Bradley, who could not score really, other than layups and cuts to the basket. It was a great screen setter. It was a decent mid-range catch and shoot guy, but he wasn't Ray Allen, but he was in that starting lineup because of what he did defensively. And Jaden, I think again, he showed glimpses of being an elite defender. But the knock on him, when I've talked to scouts about Jaden, is consistency. He has shown flashes of doing all the things that you would want, that kind of that undersized combo guard to do. He just hasn't done them consistently enough. And we saw, again, in Summer League, we saw glimpses of what he can do when he's getting pretty good minutes. But to your point, Noah, is there a way that we can see that with the big boys? Can we see that? We've seen what it looks like on the JV squad in Maine, but what about the varsity crew? Can you do that with the varsity guys? And as this has really been a happy joy conversation so far, which is why we need to make that quick left and talk about one guy who was not that great in Summer League. And I'm talking about our good friend Jordan Walsh, who I still have my Jordan Walsh stock. I am not selling it. I'm keeping it. We've just hit a little bit of turbulence in the market. It's okay. It will correct itself over time. But right now, he did not look good. His the fourth game they played, I thought was his best game. The first three, again, what are some of your takeaways when you think about what he did this summer?
Yeah, Sherrod, did you play basketball before being in media?
A little bit.
So I think when I watch Jordan, I'm watching a classic case, and like I felt this before as someone who played basketball, and also if you played another sport, I'm sure it resonates as well. But this is a mental issue that we're watching. That's what I see, at least. Like he has been so in his head through these 4 games, and even in the last game, it was better, and it got better as the game went on. But the way he's reacting to adversity on the court, and whether that's 2 missed shots or losing the ball or getting scored on, it reminds me a little bit of like young Jaylen, but worse, young Jaylen Brown. But in a sense of like he's overcompensating for a mistake that is not a bad decision, but like a shot doesn't go in. Now he's like, let me go 1-on-4 to correct that. Or I missed the 3. Let me make sure I make this 3. Now he's airballing one, and he's frustrated, and it's on his face, and he looks like a kid because he is. And I don't know that what I saw from him that was concerning so much this week was basketball, because we've watched him play enough basketball to know that is not this level of basketball, the level that we saw this past week. But the mental side is real. And to me, that's what really stood out from the Summer League performance. And we've seen it happen to all different kinds of players, right? Like Jason Tatum has had moments like this in his career where it's like, how is this the same guy that scored 50 versus the 76ers? It looks like he literally doesn't even want the ball right now. Or Sam Hauser went from almost breaking the 3-point record to a couple weeks later, he broke the record for most missed threes or something like that, right? So this is what happens. And I think as fans, people kind of overreact, or media are just kind of watching this and they're like, okay, he sucks. Like he has no future. And in reality, we're watching him be at a low right now. I don't know. I haven't watched enough of his, high school or college to know if he's had something like this. I would imagine probably not. But right now it's like he needs to just kind of snap out of what is going on mentally with him and get back to doing the things that made him a really effective G League player. And I don't know if those things are enough to be a good NBA player, but what we're watching right now is a guy who is totally in his head, I think, and is just not able to break out of it. And what he has to do, and what DJ McClay mentioned to me, which really stood out, is he has to continue competing. I asked him, like, how would you evaluate Jordan's performance? And he said, we really just need to see him continue competing. And I was thinking, that's not a good sign to hear, your coach say, I need our guaranteed player on a 4-year deal who has the biggest contract of anybody on this team right now. We need him to compete. Like, obviously he needs to compete, right? So that's, to me, what's been standing out is the mental side. And I think it's fixable because he just turned 20 and he's clearly an emotional kid and he's a hard worker and all that. But I think if we're taking away so much about the basketball, it's a little short-sighted from just 1 week of really kind of below his standard play.
Yeah, I mean, the mental side of the game is the one part that I think most fans and unfortunately too large a segment of the media just don't really get. It's so important and just valuable to players who are in that top tier. I mean, the one thing that, they typically have in common is that there's this level of mental toughness that they play with, and more importantly, can play through adversity. That doesn't mean they're always going to come out on top. That doesn't mean they're always going to win. But when they don't win, it won't be because that there was something lacking in their mental toughness. It'll be because that other team played better, or that guy it was just his night and not yours. But Jordan, he's got to really, I think, strengthen that part of his game up, the mental side of it, and deal with adversity. Because when you watch him out there playing, I mean, he's one of the most athletic guys of the guys out there in summer league, and particularly what he's able to do defensively. And he needs to get back to his roots. I know that he wanted to come in summer league and reach into the bag and say, look, guys, I can score. I can knock down shots. That's not your game. Clearly, that is not your game. That doesn't mean you can't evolve into being that kind of player. But for right now, he really needs to stick to the stuff that's going to put food on the table. You are a 3-and-D guy, and you need to embrace that and take open shots when they're there. But understand what you need to do to help this team win games and be the best version of that guy. Before we move on, I wanted to just really delve into the rookies. We haven't really talked about them, and both of those guys, I think, will be spending a considerable amount of time up in Maine. And it's not because of necessarily anything that they've done wrong or skill, but it's just the numbers game. And you've had a chance to watch Baylor. Anton Watson, both of those guys played good minutes in the summer. I want to start with Baylor first, and just how do you see his game translating to the NBA? And the Celtics are obviously part of that, but specifically looking at just in a very broad sense, how does his game look at the next level?
Yeah, I think he's going to make it. I'm really excited about both him and Anton, and the fact that I'll get to watch a lot of them in Maine. And again, I don't think they're going to spend much time with, the parent club. But the thing with Baylor that stands out so far is the passing is really, really good. And that was in his notes, but I'll be honest, I didn't watch a lot of him in college. And so this is really my first impression of watching him, in real life, and also being so close to the court where we're seated for Summer League. I feel like you get a different vantage point than you do on TV or Hub High where I normally sit. And the passing is really impressive. The shooting is obviously something that is a strength of his, and he's had his ups and downs, but he mentioned it yesterday when I talked to him after the game. He's not concerned about whether the shots are falling right now because he knows that they will fall and that he's a shooter. And so he's kind of more thinking about the other things. And that's my impression of him as well right now, is that doesn't really matter as much. And so the big question with him is whether that athleticism defensive gap can be made up. And I think that it can, because thinking about like early days, Sam Hauser, I don't know that he's far behind him. And again, just because Sam Hauser did it doesn't mean that everybody can do it. But I think with the right developmental staff around him and with hard work and with kind of getting in better shape, he seems a little bit winded to me just watching him play. Mm-hmm. Like everybody seems a little winded, but maybe he a little bit more than most. So he's going to have to get in better shape, and he's going to have to get quicker and stronger. And I think he'll do those things because he has enough going for him that I think that piece there's a gap, but it can be made up. And the fact that he's literally in his first weeks as a pro right now, and already you can see flashes of like a real NBA player, is encouraging. So I would bet that he makes it in this league. And I don't know if that ends up being a valuable role player for Boston or not. You never know how these things shake up, but he has enough things, like kind of how we were talking about Drew, where I'm not sure with Drew Peterson if he has enough to warrant the investment and warrant him being out there. With Baylor, I do see those flashes, and they're the same age. So even though it's Baylor's first year, and Drew's, it feels like he's been around, they're effectively in the same boat here. Both, played full college careers, and both are now trying to kind of make it as a pro. But Baylor just has a lot that stands out about his game and about his feel and decision making and things like that.
Yeah, and Baylor's game, we the big, as you pointed out, the big knock on him coming out was just foot speed, lateral quickness, those type of things. Wasn't great off the charts. But there was another guy that, about a decade or so ago came out with a similar profile in terms of foot speed and things like that. And his name was Klay Thompson. And Klay turned out to be a pretty damn good defender. And to me, the thing about Baylor that really jumped out to me is just the basketball IQ. It's one of those intangibles that you can't necessarily statistically point to, but your eye test will tell you when it's there. The thing about Baylor I found was that he was pretty much where he was supposed to be almost all the time defensively. And that doesn't mean that he's going to lock guys up. That doesn't mean he's always going to stay in front of them. But it won't be him being out of place because he didn't know what he was supposed to be, or he had a brain cramp, or he just forgot that, I should switch out on this guy. And instead, I'm going to just stay with this guy on the block and let this guy shoot a wide open mid-range jump shot. He's smart enough to know when he needs to move. It's just a matter of, can his body do what the mind is telling the body to do? But it's really, I think, exciting that the Celtics have a guy that is smart. And they have a lot of smart guys, but when you have a guy that you can develop and you don't have to necessarily worry about them figuring out just the basketball IQ type stuff, that you can just worry about them getting stronger, getting more athletic, better conditioning, the type of things that when you package that with a smart, high basketball IQ talent, now all of a sudden you got a guy that's competing for minutes off your bench. And if Sam Hauser, this year has a good year, hits that free agent market, he's going to get paid. And the Celtics will not, I don't anticipate, be willing to go that far to keep Sam, particularly if you got Baylor, you got Drew Peterson, right, who are, they haven't really had a chance to show what they could do. And Baylor, certainly, it's still early, but if you had to put one of those guys ahead of the other, you'd probably put Baylor ahead of Drew at this point. Obviously, as we've seen throughout the ends of time with the Boston Celtics and every other NBA team, things change. They change quickly. Marcus Smart at one point was the undisputed starting point guard, and then he gets hurt, and this little guy that Danny Ainge trades for named Isaiah Thomas comes in, plays well. Next thing you know, Marcus is no longer starting. Isaiah is a two-time All-Star. So things can change dramatically in this league. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Before we go on, I want Noah to think about this. When you look at Baylor, you look at Anton, both of those guys, they're not going to start or anything like that. But what would you like to see from them building off of the Summer League? And before you answer that question, I want to just take this time and let's hear from one of our sponsors.
It's summertime, and there's no better way to spend it than at the ballpark. Popcorn, soda, hot dogs. I'm starting to get hungry just thinking about it. Those games create lasting memories, and getting to those games is a lot easier with Game Time, which is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Now, being a Yankees fan that I am, living here in Boston, I know it gets complicated and very uncomfortable from time to time, but keeping an eye on the AL East is a really big deal for me, as you can imagine. I know I can go to the Game Time app and jump on the best deals quickly. The color coding options at the ballpark make it super easy to see what are the best deals for the best seats from all the seats in that particular venue. And you can customize your search options based on your favorite team or your favorite team to watch. The Game Time app makes it super easy to get into the game, and you can't beat Game Time's lowest price guaranteed. And when you're ready to lock up your tickets, Game Time has all-in pricing, so there's no surprise fees at checkout. Hate when that happens. Take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code CLNS for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed.
So Noah, the question I asked you right before the break, who would you like to see from Baylor and Antoine kind of build off of this? And what are the things that those guys need to do to build off of some of the positives that they certainly have had so far this summer?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this other night, Sherrod, but about how if you had Anton's defense and Baylor's offense, you have a really good player, and then you're not a player that you're able to draft, right? And so, but that's kind of it, right? So like you want to see, can Anton become a guy that's not an offensive liability, and that is a guy that can actually hit the open shot and has a relatively versatile offensive game. And I think he has that capacity. It's not like this is a guy that we know, he can't shoot, so that's never going to happen. Like we just have, it just hasn't been his role historically is to be much of a scorer and much of a shooter. And he seemed pretty happy about getting the green light to chuck up 9 threes the other night, right? So
right.
I do think that, I do think that he's going to kind of be challenged on the offensive end, and there's going to be an adjustment there. But if he can make up that gap, and again, I don't think it's something that's not feasible. I feel kind of similarly by both of them. On the end of the court that they're weaker on, there's a gap, but it doesn't feel insurmountable. And so it's can Baylor Scheierman become an average defender? That's the real question. Can he become quicker? Can he become kind of more in line with some of the other average defenders that we've seen improve from that kind of lower foot speed and to actually become very playable players? And so they each have their end of the floor that I'll be watching kind of their improvement and progress on. The other thing with Baylor that I'll say is that we're branding him as a shooter because he is one. But Sam Hauser is an elite shooter. And I think a lot of times when we get these white guys that can shoot, there's this like, oh, that's the new Sam Hauser. But it's not the new Sam Hauser because Sam Hauser has never shot below 40% from three in a single season in his entire career. High school, college, pro. That's like, there are very few guys that have that kind of shooting record. And so Drew Peterson's not going to come in and shoot like that. Neither is Baylor Scheierman. So you want to see like what kind of shooter Baylor actually is at this level. And, it's deeper threes. You have to have a quicker release. There are things that are going to make it a little bit harder. There's going to be less attention on him than there was in college. But he, those factors that, that extra foot back and, that extra half second, sometimes that's the difference between being a 42% three-point shooter and a 32%. And if you're a 32% three-point shooter, you no longer have a spot here, right? So that's what I'll be curious about as well, is just like, can he actually be that shooter that we're all envisioning when we talk about his future?
Yeah, absolutely. And as they near the end of Summer League, you've got the G Leaguers, you've got the guys they drafted, but there's still some other guys who don't fall into one of those nice and tidy buckets that, we got a chance to watch. Ron Harper Jr., who reportedly signed an Exhibit 10 contract with the Celtics. You got Tatum's old state championship winning teammate, Tyler Cook, who did some really, real good solid college player at Iowa. And then we've got our good friend Jaylen House, who brings a lot of energy to the game. He likes to talk smack out there, and I love that about him. I absolutely love that about him. And if you ever wondered whether that's Eddie's son, that was the moment when I realized, yes, that is Eddie's son. Good player. And Jameis Ramsey is another one I thought that did some really interesting things. But here's the thing what I'm curious your thoughts on. Who among those guys, or maybe someone else that we haven't talked about yet, but who has done enough in your eyes that you want to see more of them in training camp? You want to see what they can do, when you're playing with the Tatums, Browns, Derek Whites, Drew Holidays of the world. Is there one of those guys that we just mentioned, or someone we haven't talked about, who's on the Summer League team that you'd like to see more of in training camp?
Yeah, I mean, I want to see more of Jaylen House just because he's fun. So I want to see more of him. Like you said, watching that game yesterday, that game was not the most thrilling basketball game I've ever watched. But every time he was involved in the action, I found myself locking back in. So he's someone that it's fun to watch. I don't know if defensively that he can make up that size disadvantage. I mean, there are so few guys in my lifetime that have been able to do that. And he's even smaller than them, seemingly. I mean, he'll bulk up, but I think he was going to be a really good player wherever he does play, whether that's overseas or in the G League. Like, I think he'll be really good because he's clearly he's polished in a lot of ways, and he really impressed me. I don't know that I see an NBA future for him, so maybe he's on my list of like guys I'd love to see in Maine just for fun, and I'm sure he'll have a long, great basketball career wherever he plays. And he sort of alluded to that the other night too. He said, I just don't want to be playing basketball. Like, he just said that. I don't think that he has to be in the NBA necessarily. And then Jameis Ramsey had showed flashes of like scoring brilliance, but I don't love watching guys in that environment where like his job is to come off the bench and try to score a little bit to turn some heads, because you don't get to really watch him as an all-around player, and you don't get to really envision what he would look like on an NBA team. So he didn't show me enough to make me think like, oh, I can see this role for him, or I can see him doing these little things, because he was just like a microwave, and he was good at it, and he was efficient during Summer League. So my prediction will be that if there is a guy that they pull for that last two-way, or if they end up waiving one of the existing two-ways and grabbing an additional player, it's probably going to be somebody from a different Summer League team. And I think this is what I always forget watching Summer League, is that, the Celtics scouting department and everybody, they're watching their guys, but they're also watching everybody, because in a week, it won't really matter what jersey they were wearing. And Drew Peterson's an example. He's a guy that had a really good performance against the Maine Celtics last summer. And then obviously they picked him up a few months later when he became available. So I could see them kind of. I've been watching a lot of other games, so maybe when they do pick a player, I'll be like, oh, I actually watched him on that last weekend in Vegas when nobody else was here and saw him score 30. But that's what I expect to happen, is that it's actually not one of those guys, because nobody really stood out from the group that you mentioned, at least in the sample that we've had so far.
Okay, so Noah, our good friend Brad, Executive of the Year Stevens. He graced us with his presence, gave us a little bit of time at Summer League. What were some of your just kind of more memorable takeaways from our time with Brad, in Vegas?
Yeah, I think the thing that stood out to me the most was I asked him about O'Shea and a potential reunion there, and he didn't say no, but I walked away thinking we're not going to see O'Shea and Green any longer, because he said, we might need that spot for a big, effectively, because of he referenced the long recovery ahead of Porzingis. He also said O'Shea might want more minutes. So it sounded like he was coming up with a bunch of reasons why it's probably not going to happen. So that was one takeaway for me. And then this was a really small thing, but Bobby asked him about the Jaylen Derek White situation. And he said, Jaylen's a great player. He's good enough to be on any team, any Olympic team at any point, which we all know is true. But he also snuck in there and he mentioned, he flagged that Jaylen brought up the fact that he called Derek White. And I think Brad really wanted to highlight that. And this is my own interpretation. So that's my opinion, not what he said. But I do think by the way he said that Brad was not thrilled with the way Jaylen handled it and the Derek White component. And then he was really glad that he clarified the Derek White piece. Because I'm sure from the Celtics front office standpoint, that whole saga, 2 weeks after winning the championship, was a little bit of a bummer that happened. And you want to make sure that Derek doesn't feel slighted by his teammate or anything like that. And all of a sudden now the world is all out to get, out criticizing Derek every time there's a post of him on Team USA or the NBA accounts. This should be Jaylen Brown. So the way that he kind of snuck that in there, I felt like he was glad that Jaylen had the opportunity to speak here in Vegas, that he clarified, that he called and congratulated Derek and that they're all good. And he made sure to note that to us again. So I thought that was interesting that he really flagged that. But other than that, I think it was the same stuff from Brad that we normally hear around just being grateful for the guys that he has, being grateful about the extensions, kind of all of that.
Yeah. And it was definitely, Brad messaging to the rest of the world that, hey, everyone, we're okay. Everyone's good. We're still kumbaya. We love each other. We're champions. There's nothing to see here. And that may be true, but Brad recognized the same thing I think a lot of Celtics fans recognize, and that is, yeah, you can feel snubbed, but damn. At least give your boy a shout out and say congrats. And that was the thing that was missing in Jaylen's initial discourse about Nike and being snubbed, was that there was no public acknowledgement that your teammate, who is probably the most popular guy on the team, if you were to poll Celtics fans, I think Derek White would win in a landslide over everyone, Tatum included. It felt very much like Jaylen was so caught up in his own anger and disappointment and frustration about not making the team that he missed one of the most obvious things he should have done when he went public with his feelings, and that's give Derek his props. I mean, this is a dude that didn't even have a Division I scholarship offer coming out of high school, who is now a freaking Olympian. Are you kidding me? That's like one of those made-for-TV movies that someone cooks up in a Hollywood studio, and people are like, no, we're not going to do this because that's not realistic. There's no way that could ever happen. There's no way a guy could go from being undrafted, to go from having no scholarship offers to Division I to all of a sudden being an Olympian. There's no way that could happen. And so, that was Brad. I think Brad was I think very much in tune with most of Celtics Nation about how Jaylen didn't handle that as well as he should have. But the one point that you did bring up, and that's going to bring us to our final questioners of the day, and we're going to play a little game called Pick and Roll. You pick a position and you roll with it and explain why you're picking that position. Now, Brad, he alluded to the fact that they're probably going to keep that 15th roster spot open. And he kind of alluded to that, you just never know what they're going to need. You're looking at the roster, it seems pretty obvious if they're going to add it. It's probably going to be a big. So, pick and roll. Do you go youth and continue to develop that next wave of Celtics who aren't probably going to play now, but they may help you down the road? Or do you go for an impact big who could potentially come in and give you 10, 15, 20 minutes a night, regardless of whether it's Al, Porzingis, whoever, but an established veteran who can play right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I go with a more veteran big because I really like the young project big that we have on the roster, and I don't think we need another one personally. And I also think that from what it sounds like, I feel like every time we hear about this Porzingis injury, it sounds like the recovery is going to be a little bit longer. Like I feel like they add an extra really long every time we hear about it. So
Right.
yeah, I think we're not going to see Porzingis for the first half of the season or something like that. And just thinking about the fact that Al can't play back-to-backs. Xavier Tillman also, I don't think, can handle significant minutes. I think he has his own knee stuff as well. And so he's not a guy you want to put a heavy load on. You're really relying on Luke and Nimi, and I really like both of those guys, but they both have weaknesses in their game. And not to mention the fact that all of a sudden Luke has a hamstring strain, which he had a couple this year, or it was a calf strain or something like that, and he misses some time. Next thing you know, you have a big load on a guy that's pretty unproven. So I like the idea of getting a more veteran big, so long as it's not going to be somebody that is like demands minutes and is going to become a locker room issue if he doesn't get them. And I remember Andre Drummond was a name that was kind of bouncing around during the trade, near the trade deadline. And he's not, he's a guy that has a complicated track record in locker rooms. I wouldn't want to bring someone in that all of a sudden kind of disrupt the flow. But if you can get a more experienced guy that's comfortable, potentially maybe not playing at all, I think that's what you're going for, even if it's not somebody that has much of a ceiling or who'll only be here for a year and, doesn't have a lot of upside.
Yeah, it has to be the right fit for your culture. Yeah. And you look at, like, as you touched on with Tillman, very few 25-year-olds will get traded to a team that they know they're not going to play much at all, and be okay with that. Like, actually say, I'm just going to stay ready. He's one of the Stay Ready crew members, and then to top it off, you play sparingly. You win a championship, and then you re-sign for essentially a role that's not going to be that dramatically different than the one that you had when you weren't playing that much. With Porzingis' injury, obviously there's an opportunity to get on the floor earlier. But to your point, Noah, there's a certain amount of load management that he has to undergo as well. So it'll be interesting to see what the Celtics do with the big situation, because it's definitely, if you had to look at an area of weakness / concern with the Celtics going into the season, it has to be their big man rotation. It's very unsettled now, and the X factor that so many of us talked about before the season that would get them over the top and win a championship, Porzingis, is not going to be there at the start of the season. If he's back by the All-Star break, I would be moderately surprised by that, because I do think that this injury is going to take longer for him to get back on the court than I think their initial diagnosis. And part of that, I think, is because they're going to be super, super careful with him. I think there's going to be a point where he is going to go through all the tests, all the physical stuff to get back on the floor, and they're just going to hold him out a little bit longer just to make sure that he's ready to play and be able to play at a high level when he gets on the floor. So, it'll be interesting to see how the Celtics handle that and all those different challenges that come with being a defending NBA champion, which we will absolutely be delving into much more as we roll through the summer, into the fall, start of training camp, and obviously the regular season with the 2024 Boston Celtics, Banner 18, having Boston Celtics look to defend their championship. Noah, this was good. We should do this again. We should absolutely do this again.
Yeah,
Noah,
anytime.
Noa Dalzell from Celtics blog, and a regular contributor to CLNS Media Network in a variety of roles. And again, thank you for your time, Noah. And also, before we get out of here, I want to give a special shout out to Prize Picks, the exclusive daily fantasy partner of CLNS Media Network, and also our good friends at Game Time, which takes the guesswork out of buying last-minute tickets to your favorite sporting events. That came in really handy when the Chicago Sky were playing the Las Vegas Aces. When we were out there, that worked out well for quite a few of us. Just download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. That's create an account, use the code CLNS, and get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. That is it for this episode of the Big 3 NBA podcast. For Noa Dalzell. This is Sherrod Blakely. Thank you for checking us out. Take care, folks.